In September of 1984, Milos Forman would release what many would consider as his magnum opus, Amadeus. The film, about composers Antonio Salieri and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the man with the most insane name ever and personality to match, would go on to win the 1985 Oscar for Best Picture as well as 7 other awards that year. This wasn't the first time the Academy decided to award Best Picture to a historical film. Films like Lawrence of Arabia and Braveheart have taken home top honors before. Even the likely Best Picture winner this year, Dunkirk, is a historical film. Despite this critical success, films like Amadeus have not gone without their fair share of criticism, and it's safe to say the majority of that criticism comes from the historical inaccuracies present in the film. Many claim that the film misrepresented Mozart and Salieri and the relationship between the two men. The criticism of Amadeus misrepresenting history despite claiming to be a historical period piece is not a criticism major Hollywood releases are unfamiliar with. Throughout the years, films like The Last Samurai and even films released as recently as Selma have been subjected to similar criticisms. Many would say that it's an attempt by Hollywood to undermine history and make a greater profit, but I would argue there's more to these changes than meets the eye. Historical inaccuracies in film are not always egregious misrepresentations of history, but are instead an attempt by filmmakers to make the history presented more personal, coherent, and interesting for film audiences. Take, for example, Terrence Malick's 2005 historical drama The New World, about the relationship between John Smith and Pocahontas and its use of voiceover. The voiceovers, while being completely fabricated, add a layer of realism and relatability to the characters that might otherwise be missing. The most important part is that they add to John Smith and Pocahontas' characters instead of contradicting the real historical figures that they're based on. Saving Private Ryan has been praised as one of the most brutally accurate depictions of the horrors of war ever put to film. However, its plot and characters are completely fictional. This gives Saving Private Ryan more room than most historical films to dramatize the past, as it's not claiming to represent actual people, but rather an event. It puts the audience in the middle of this event using fictional characters and details as a vehicle to do so. Contrast this with something like The Patriot, a film that alters historical fact to make its protagonists seem like saints, while adding in a scene of British troops burning a church full of civilians to make them appear more villainous. This is awful not because that never actually happened, but because this spreads misinformation as the film claims to be based on actual events. Historical films shouldn't change history to fit their narrative like in The Patriot, but instead go the Saving Private Ryan route and change their narrative to fit history. Even in something like Amadeus, where they exaggerate the personality quirks of Salieri and Mozart, whereas The Patriot, it just kind of makes stuff up. Really, the issue is going to come down to the viewer. Some won't take issue with the inaccuracies, and others will have problems with the changes that are made. But the point I'm trying to make is that film audiences shouldn't go into these movies expecting an accurate history lesson. That's not to say historical films can't or shouldn't teach film audiences something about history, but there is a reason the genre is labeled historical fiction, and there's a reason there's text towards the beginning of most of these films that reads, "based on a true story." Amadeus is again a perfect example of this, as the movie was based on a play of the same name by Peter Shaffer, which was already fairly fictionalized. Even then, I would still argue the film does a pretty good job representing both Mozart and Salieri. It just seems a bit monotonous to complain about inaccuracies in a genre labeled historical fiction when there's already the documentary, a genre of film created to be specifically as educational and factual as possible. Sometimes there is simply too much history to fit into a standard 2-hour historical film, so the history must be condensed and creative liberties have to be taken. Life doesn't usually follow a 3-act structure, and filmmakers usually aren't able to tell these stories verbatim. And when it comes to filmmaking, especially within the boundaries of a genre labeled historical fiction, it is arguably more important to make a film coherent and compelling rather than 100% historically accurate.